Good afternoon and welcome to Vermelo Live here with Scaling Under Pressure, where we're going to be talking honestly about all the things building scale-ups and what it actually looks like behind the scene. My name is Benga and I'm part of Vermelo team. I'm a talent solutions specialist with strong focus helping scale-ups and growing businesses. But today it's not going to be about me. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by amazing Chris Bosworth, who is founder of Finclusion. And as we met last year briefly in London, I actually found out he's also from Wigan. So that is something we have got common. We are both Northerners, however, we both live separate. I'm down in sunny Devon and Chris is based in London. But Chris, great to have you with us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you are building, what you have learned along the way, and of course, what scaling actually looks like in real life. So welcome, Chris, and tell us a bit more about Finclusion and what problems are you guys solving?
Thanks, Santa. Yeah, we're so Finclusion is a auto finance provider. So we fund consumers in their car purchasing journey. We're focused on underserved customers, so people who wouldn't be able to get finance from a traditional lender, bank or non-bank lender, and we look to help them into affordable mobility, basically, and that's our role. So effectively, myself and my co-founders worked in auto finance for quite a long time, um, normally at the other end of the market, so in the prime market. And I think we saw a lot of customers that weren't being addressed by that market. And as time has gone on, car finance become quite technologically enabled, so quite sort of a lot of data involved, a lot of pre-approvals, nice frictionless journeys, and that wasn't really translating into the underserved market. So we've effectively decided that we would have to take on that challenge, basically. So we're looking to uh, build a product to underserved customers, but that looks like the product you would get if you were a prime customer.
Yeah.
So effectively making people feel valued throughout that journey, leaning into what how they want to be dealt with, rather than necessarily making them jump through lots of hoops on our side. So yeah, that's the objective.
Obviously, you have previously scaled Lendable, which is motor finance division from zero, and now you've been building Finclusion. But tell us more, what drew you to build this sort of business with Finclusion?
It's really just that the market has moved on so much. So I started working auto finance about 10 years ago. And in that 10 years, if you're a prime customer, the service level has increased exponentially. You get a lot of pre-approved offers. There's such a depth of lending panel. So, you know, if you're a prime customer, you've got lots of options. You can secure finance within minutes and drive away. That
Yeah.
benefit has not really been extended into the underserved markets. So partly because there's increased complexity. So a lot of lenders struggle with the sort of income profiles of those customers, or they've got thinner credit files, etc. So yeah, so really we wanted to build a platform that sort of looks to address those problems
Mm.
and deliver a sort of prime level service to a underserved customer.
But I suppose goes hand in hand how time has changed. When we look back previous years, we always have had sort of 9 to 5 jobs, stable incomes. Like myself, my son, he's 19, and his idea of staying in one job for 20, 40 years is absolutely crazy. And I
Yeah.
suppose that also goes hand in hand with the fact that a lot of people these days, they are, freelancers, self-employed, and their situation might, like you say, on paper, might not look as appealing, and they're not the standard people, but you looks like are helping this new type of generation, which are sort of more complex, but in the same time, obviously, they, in my eyes, should have exactly the same opportunities when it comes to car finance.
Yeah, exactly. As I say, there's nothing better or worse about these
Yeah.
customers. As I say, it's all about complexity. So they're just more complex from an underwriting and affordability assessment point of view. But yeah, as I say, we've built the platform to try and address those issues. And yeah, so far so good.
Excellent, excellent. So let's talk about now about lessons. What lessons from scaling Lendable have been the most useful this time around? Because I can imagine, once you scaled one sort of business and building new one, there is loads of lessons you can take and use. They always say, learn from experience. So you've had
Yeah.
that experience yourself. So what are the lessons scaling Lendable you've been most useful this time around?
Yeah, I don't know if they're lessons. I mean, you definitely discover things that you like that
Yeah.
and things you don't like, but I mean, a lot of it is personal. So some of the things that I would have as takeaways, other people might think that it was, better the other way around, sort of thing. So, I mean, in terms of going into Finclusion, I guess we had a couple of objectives that came out of our collective experience, not just my experience,
Mm.
but my other co-founders' experience as well. So I think one was to keep the team quite small. I
Yeah.
think a lot of the time you're measured by various growth metrics, particularly if you're VC backed, and one of those metrics can be headcount.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a vanity metric, really. So we've tried to sort of keep the team quite small, quite lean. We only really, would make a hire when absolutely stretched or where we have to for regulatory reasons. Um, so, we're not building a team for the sake of, saying we've got X number of employees, um, which, does happen in that world. And then I think the other thing was knowing, like, having a clearer idea, let's say, of what's in your wheelhouse. So,
Yeah.
are you a software company? Are you a lending company? Are you a distribution company? Like, what do you want to focus on? And those things that you're not aren't your sort of key differentiators, they can
Mm.
be outsourced. You don't necessarily have to carry all of the burden of those. Whereas I think when you haven't done it before, the temptation is to build everything from
Every,
scratch. Um, and
yeah.
a lot of those things you build from scratch probably, you've just reinvented a wheel you didn't really need to reinvent. So
Mm.
it's great if you've raised loads of money, but again, we try to keep quite lean. So we
Mhm.
do have external investors. I'm not saying we've bootstrapped the business, but it's not in that sort of VC merry-go-round that we've been in before, where you're constantly doing a sort of seed round, A, B,
Yeah.
C, D, and you've got to deliver growth metrics against that. It's a little bit more considered,
Mm.
and a little bit more we're closer to bootstrapping, albeit, let's say, because we're a consumer credit company, we've had to raise
Yeah.
external capital because you need a lot of capital to lend, basically. But yeah,
Mm.
so I'd say they're the biggest things. Is that we're trying to be efficient and profitable and productive rather than just big for the sake of being big.
Mm. Interesting what you said regards, you don't have to build everything from scratch.
Yeah,
And I think that's quite a big pain point. I hear a lot of businesses feel like, they have to do everything their own and internal. But actually, when you realize externally, there is already so much knowledge. They've done it before. And
yeah,
sometimes I feel, is it the ego? Is it the pride that stops us looking outside instead of kind of going, okay, we don't have to do. That's really, really good point you made there, Chris.
yeah,
So moving on to more to biggest pain points, what would you say as you are scaling up and move kind of beyond the early stages?
yeah,
What are the biggest pain points? You did mention a little bit about the number of people you have on the team. They are quite lean, I guess.
yeah.
Would that be one of the pain points you have experienced yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think. as you get bigger, you become more reliant on processes and less reliant on relationships, I guess. So I guess when a team is sort of sub 50 people, you can know everyone really well, know everyone's strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Um, your sort of need for a process, other than what we need for regulation, is less, if that makes sense. So,
Mm,
you know, everyone is high performing, everyone is you know very well, um, and everyone just gets on with things. But then as you grow beyond that into the 100 people, 150, 200 people, you need processes basically, because you can't know everyone anymore, and you can't sort of work on that in that relationship based way. So then you start putting processes in place, but then you need
mm,
managers to manage against those processes. So it ends up being relatively like exponential. And I think your productivity per head actually goes down
okay.
in the short term. So I think obviously if you want to grow to be a huge company, these companies that are going for sort of $1 billion valuations, $10
Yeah.
billion valuations, you can't really stick with 50 people. There's very few um, very few companies of that evaluation that are still at 50 people. So you kind of at some stage have to rip off that bandage. But
Mm,
I think one of the things for us was actually, can we build a profitable, productive, efficient business and not break through that barrier? So
mm,
I think,
right.
our intention is to try and keep the team lean sort of all the way through, if we can. And a lot of that comes from, as I was saying before, not building teams around things that are not your area of expertise. So, you know, in terms of how many people touch our products and touch our business, it probably is in
Mm,
the hundreds, but just they're not employed by us. They're employed by third-party vendors that we're using
mm.
to sort of that we stitch together effectively to build our product.
Interesting. So actually following that from your experience, what tends to break first? So we talk about obviously people, we talk about processes, structure, and communication. So in that journey, you mentioned everything, but what do you feel is the one thing that would start breaking first?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way you could say the process is what breaks first, because you don't have process early doors, if you
Mhm.
see what I mean. Like, we do, because we're FCA regulated business, so you have a set of processes, but everyone is also a highly capable
Yeah.
person. So there's a lot of ability to communicate around that, work around that. So, the process is almost like a framework
Yeah.
from which you can sort of elaborate. Whereas as you so it in the early stages, the process is by its nature it's broken, whereas you can't afford for it to be broken when you're bigger.
Mm,
So as you get larger, that process has to become more and more robust and
yeah.
more sort of non-negotiable, which is when structure starts to come into play. So effectively you move away from you know person-to-person communication and more into
Mm,
like structured cascading of information and things like that. So, before Lendable, I worked in a bank, and in a big bank like that with thousands of employees,
mm,
everything is cascaded, right? There's no real ability for information to go straight from the shop floor up to the board.
mm.
Everything, goes layer by layer. So it's just a very different process.
Interesting. So, what has been the hardest trade-offs? I always hear there is a price to pay for everything. So we either kind of, doing something or not doing. And I remember I
Yep.
heard this saying, even making no decision is actually making a decision. So whilst you have been growing, what's been the hardest sort of trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. It's the old phrase of choose your hard, right? There's different,
Yeah.
if you do make one bit of your life easier, it's normally at the expense of something else. So, I mean, I think the hardest thing, well, we were talking about it briefly, I guess, before.
Mm,
The hardest thing when you have a bunch of highly capable, high-performing people is not to let them burn themselves out. So
yeah.
it's a funny one where you have in a big bank, let's say, with thousands of employees, one of your big issues might be motivation and actually getting
Mm.
people to contribute to the
Yeah.
levels you want them to contribute at. I think, particularly for me this week, one of my main issues is, someone that is quite visibly overworking. So it's kind of, how do you discourage them from doing that? Because you know where it's going to end up, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a bit odd in that sense. You do have this like curve of, again, when you're
Mm.
smaller, it's a lot of like almost controlling people, not controlling people, but like stopping, holding people back a bit. And then
Yeah.
as you get bigger, it's the other way where you've got to push them to actually do something.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And has these pain points changed in scaling in regulator environments, would you say at all?
Yeah, so they do a little bit. I mean, I think if we were unregulated, we'd have stayed a lot leaner for a lot
Mm.
longer. There is a minimum framework that's required to be
Yeah.
regulated. Um, think process-wise as well, we've had to document our processes in a robust way from day one, because people, want to know you're doing the right thing, and
Of
want that
course.
documented. You can't just, if we were a retailer, you could have an element of trust there that, we want our employees to do the right things by customers. We trust that they do. Doesn't really work when you're a regulated business. So as a concept, so
Mm.
yeah, that's a big thing for us.
Yeah, it is. And I guess, to balance the ambition, because you have obviously ambition to grow, but you also in governance and risk responsible sort of market where you need to kind of balance that. So how do you go about that type of balance? Whereas growth ambition with governance, risk, and responsible decision making?
Yeah, I don't see compliance as being a problem in that regard. I mean, the
Mm.
regulator in the UK has like become progressively more and more
Yeah.
pro-growth, I think. I mean, if you think the fastest growing company in the UK is Revolut, and they've just become a bank, so it
Yes,
doesn't get
I
much
saw
more
that.
regulated than being a bank. So I think I think actually in a weird way, regulation can actually help with that because it gives
Yeah.
you a moat. Um, Getting regulated used to be a relatively big barrier. If it has sort of become a little bit easier more
Mm.
recently, but yeah, I think that allows you to innovate within a framework, actually
Mhm.
allows you to be a bit more focused. So
Yeah.
I don't know, I wouldn't say regulation is that my big, and talking about lessons learned from previous experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my big things is whether the venture capital model is the right model for lending.
Interesting. Yeah.
If you think about like our product is money. It's
Yeah.
pretty easy to get people to take money. It's just, the key is to give it to people who are going to pay it back to you. And so the problem is you could hire a lot, you could distribute a lot of funds very quickly. Your sort
Mm.
of high level metrics would look quite good from a VC perspective, and then it could go very wrong very quickly if you don't get paid back. So it doesn't, the credit risk element and the venture
Mm.
capital funding model don't
Yeah.
always align super well.
Has there been any moments where risk and compliance, the considerations change your growth plans?
Yeah, so I think risk-wise, definitely, as I say, risk
Mm.
more so than compliance. I think for us, because we're new to market, we want to
Mm.
demonstrate that our risk models are robust and that they work well. So you do moderate your growth while you're in that sort of testing
Yeah.
phase. And that can be a little bit frustrating, for members of the team that, they've joined an early stage company to be on a high growth trajectory. And you're like, well, let's just calm down and make sure this works first. So it's kind of, there is that element as well. But I wouldn't say massively. I mean, obviously, because this isn't the first time we've done this, like you come into it with the knowledge that that's going to be the
Yeah.
case, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think we haven't changed our growth plans, but our growth plans were somewhat dictated by the fact that we were going to have to manage risk through the early
Mm.
phase.
course, of course. So talking about obviously growth and growth can't happen without people. One of the obviously biggest, I think, part of scaling and growing any type of company, yes, you need to have a great product. But for that to happen, let's be honest, we need obviously the people. So when we talking and looking at hiring, has there been any challenges of hiring, biggest pain points for scale ups? Like you said, you are very sort of conservative when it comes to adding, numbers just for adding sake. And like you say, sometimes, companies can look, okay, one of the metrics for a company, if they are scaling and growing, is the numbers, and they might go and put all that effort in hiring. But what would you say, hiring challenges? What is the biggest sort of pain points for scale ups?
Yeah, I mean, obviously for us, we're a bit too early stage for any of those issues. But yeah, I mean, historically, I think it's when you have to sort of mechanize your hiring is
Mm,
always a bit of an issue. So when you're sort of 30, 40, 50 people, it's almost like hiring by consensus, right? Every new person meets everyone, all your people are sort of A grade people. And I think in general, A grade people
mm,
can find other A grade people better. So it's just
yeah.
kind of it's a little bit easier at that stage. I think once you breach that 150 and you've sort of got to have talent acquisition partners and
Yeah.
hiring process, it's again that transition to process. I guess you've got hiring process and your very senior people don't have time to be involved in the hiring, so you end up with middle managers doing the hiring. And are they
Mhm.
really the A grade people? Therefore, can they differentiate between A and B grade people? So it's kind of I think there the challenge is really
Yeah.
is when you have to mechanize it because yeah, again, when you're smaller, it's a bit easier, I think.
Would you say then when you are smaller, people would have to naturally wear a lot more hats on their heads?
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, I always think job titles are a bit of a joke, really, at this phase because it's kind of like everyone's doing a little bit of everything, aren't they? So it's,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's more based on what you've done before, your job title, rather than what you're actually doing now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's yeah, definitely 100%. I mean, everyone's wearing lots of hats. I mean, even from morning through to lunchtime, you could be doing what in a bank would be like six different roles. So it's,
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the fun, right? That's also why
Yeah.
people
And
do
I think
this.
that some people crave that type of environment, the unknown and the
Yeah,
excitement of, developing in that journey so many skills that you even I think you didn't even realize, you are capable on. And that is super, super exciting. But obviously, as that sort of business grows, the capability gaps tends to show up, would you say? And how do you kind of notice? Because, like you said, when they were small, you do everything, you wear so many hats. But what capability gaps tend to show up as a business grows?
yeah. I mean, I think it's that point, isn't it? It's the things that you were doing because you had to that aren't really your area of expertise,
Yeah,
and you don't let it go quickly enough, if that makes sense. So,
yeah,
um, I often it's certain functions. I mean, we didn't do this again because of past experience, but credit risk is often one of those in startup lenders. The founder
mm,
thinks, and maybe they've got a product background. They think they can have a go at credit risk, but because fundamentally it's just algorithms, and I do algorithms, so it's fine. But actually, it is a bit of an art as well as a science. So
yeah,
I think there's certain, and probably this you could say the same for finance. We don't have a dedicated finance team as it stands. It's basically I do the sort of finance director
yeah,
role, and then we use an accounting firm for the sort of more granular tasks. So it's kind of that. Um, there will become a point where that probably isn't appropriate, and it's like
yeah,
the trick is detecting that. rather
Mm.
than pushing it too far. And particularly when, you have a mindset like ours where we do try and avoid hiring if we don't have to. Um, there is a sort of almost an eagerness to say, oh no, I'll keep doing that for a bit longer. I'll keep doing that for a bit
Mm.
longer. But I'm not an expert at that sort of thing. So, and we have pockets of that all over the business, which you
Mm.
do. So I think that's the hardest part, is recognizing, I guess, when you have a capability gap and when the
Mm.
business is of size where it can't tolerate that gap anymore, and you need
Mm.
to find someone who has that expertise.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, following from that, would love to know. It's like you said, you are a little bit kind of trying not to hire. It's
Yeah,
kind of, it sounds like it's the last resort before
yeah,
like it's a must. But how do you approach the perm versus contract? You did mention obviously there is, third parties involved
yeah.
as you scale and grow, and there is not everything in-house. Is there any particular kind of ideology? How do you think behind perm and contract on that moment of sort of looking at hiring?
I think it's more about the skills that you need and how long you think you're going to need them for, and
Mm.
how you can best get them. So, there's an individual that worked with us as a contractor, and well, technically still does work with us as a contractor, who's going to go into a permanent role with us from
Yeah.
May. And I think that's quite an interesting one, because it's almost like they get to try it, we get to try it.
Yes.
And in that case, it's been a good fit, and we need that skill set going forward.
Mm.
Whereas the other time we tend to use contractors as if it's more, you know, you've got a very specific thing that needs to get done.
Mhm.
And once that's done, there's probably not the need for a full-time person to do it anymore.
Mm.
So yeah, we've got someone we're working with at the moment as a contractor, um, who's doing a very specific project. And when that project's finished, he probably won't work with us, at least for a period of time, until something
Yeah.
else that's in his area of expertise crops up, and I'm sure we'll reach out to him again. So
Mm.
but again, that's the way he wants to work as well. So I think that's the other thing. There's some people who have the skill set you want, who
Yeah.
don't want to work a full-time job. Want to
Yeah.
spend 3 months a year in South America or something. So you need to be flexible, to get the skills that you need.
Yeah. And interesting is like contractors contractors can be two sort of sides to the business. One,
Yeah,
like you mentioned, you can have somebody in before you commit
yeah,
permanently. You can sort of see how it works. And I
yeah,
suppose it's not just from your side, but for the candidate side
yeah,
would be exactly the same. I think these days we're a lot more talking about, work-life balance. We're talking about environment. It's not a case of I just need to get a job and
yeah,
hold on to that. I think there is more sort of holistic approach. And I suppose one of the ways of trying before you commit full time permanently, it's for your side and also for the person's benefit. But then other way, obviously, contractors work because you only need for small periods of time, which works for both parties. And
yeah,
following on to that, I would love to hear actually from you from a leadership perspective, because you as a leader, has leadership changed as the business scales? Because you must have gone through so many learning curves yourself,
yeah,
becoming a leader, leading, changing from sort of smaller teams to bigger teams. Now, again, you are back to squares. Sort of
yeah,
zero, really. You're
yeah.
back to being, millions hats, you're back to sort of rolling up your sleeves and getting into trenches. So tell me more about your own leadership and how has that changed as the business scales?
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difference, as you just highlighted. It's the doing versus the managing
Yeah.
elements, I guess. So, I mean, I actually talk about capabilities. I'm not the best manager.
Okay.
I would say I'm a sort of very good doer who hopes that people will pick that up through osmosis almost. So I guess it's leadership by example is probably the technical way of putting it. But it's yeah, and I think that's why I don't get on in bigger organizations. And so, as you say, part of the trigger for me to start again is often sort of, oh, this has got too big. It's the skill set required here is a political one, not a sort of capability, technical capability. So that's normally when I say, right, fine, let's stop this and do something new. And I think probably that's also the reason why we're keen for this particular project not to get like that, because I guess we don't want to ever feel compelled to leave. So it's kind of, I think by keeping it small, keeping it manageable, it allows us to sort of, hopefully do it for a lot longer. So I think, in terms of, I think, I mean, I know the question was more about how's your own leadership changed. I don't know if it really does, is the point I suppose I'm trying to make. So the businesses change, and you can try and be, 10% better at one thing or whatever, but fundamentally your personality doesn't change. So it's kind of, I think it's sometimes you've got to put the square peg in the square hole, and particularly, I mean, the Lendable example is a really good one. I was getting to a point where I knew I wasn't the right person for that role anymore. Recruited someone into a more junior role who would grow into doing that role. So it was quite organized transition, if that makes sense. So I think sometimes being aware of those gaps helps you manage the transition a bit better. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Funny what you said, I heard, is you knew you are not right for the role anymore with Lendable. And that is such a, I think, humble thing to say, because some people would see that as a maybe negative, but sometimes it's not about us being perfect in that role. We sometimes can outgrow the role. We sometimes need a new challenge, and we are okay to do that. But that's really, really refreshing to hear. And moving on to what can we give to other founders, I would love to kind of dig a little bit in last sort of 5 minutes with, what are the growth challenges founders often react too late from your experience? So other maybe, founders listening to this can be thinking, okay, what can I learn from Chris? He has gone through already these lessons. I don't want to be in the same sort of, lessons myself. I want to overcome them before they arise. What would you say?
I mean, you've got sort of high-level business stuff. I was actually at an event yesterday, talked to a few different people. We all came to the same conclusion that we wish we'd had a better understanding of capital stacks before we started. So I think, understanding your investors, not just what the money you're raising this round, but sort of what the long-term strategy is, bearing in mind things like dilution and warrants and stuff like that. So really understanding the capital side of your business, like the funding side. I think most people underestimate that. They learn as they go, which is actually quite a bad way to learn, because you're facing off to experts who are highly incentivized to screw you over. So so there is that. And then I think operationally, it's what we talked about before, which is knowing when to give up a bit of your role, if that makes sense, because you've got, you're starting off with 100 hats, and um, 5 years in, you've probably narrowed that down to 10 hats, and it's how do you shed those 90 hats, and when is kind of I think again, it's a bit of an art. It's going to be different for everyone, but I think maybe assessing your own performance quite regularly and saying, am I the best person to be doing this particular task or not, is quite important.
Interesting. And I guess that is an art. Some people will learn from listening, others reading, obviously, connecting, networking, but most I guess lessons happen as you are on the ground floor, as you are doing obviously what you're doing the best, and then these lessons comes. But the biggest pain point for scale ups should expect, if there was one or two things that you could pass on to another founder, another business sort of, owner who are in that stage, or maybe even at the earliest stage, looking ahead and want to prepare, what would be the pain point scale up should expect?
I think in that scale up phase, it's what we talked about before around the incremental benefit you get of each new head. So I think there's this, in the early days, every time you hire, there's this like increase in productivity. As I say, there becomes a point when that actually goes backwards a little bit
Yeah.
because you're having to put in management layers. So, and nearly everyone gets that wrong. Everyone thinks that,
Okay.
if I've got 50 heads and I hire another 50, I'll be twice as productive. But that
Wow.
really isn't how it works. So yeah, really, that's the one you find out the hard way, which is that actually to go from 50 to 100, you've actually got to go from 50 to 150 to double your sort of capacity. So it's yeah, and because people don't factor in the cost of that,
Yeah.
they make the wrong decisions from a return on investment perspective in terms of
Yeah.
recruiting. So yeah, I think that's the big one, is just the sort of, and I guess in general that's looking at your end goal and your like target
Mm.
state and how you're
Yeah.
going to get there, rather than if you make every decision incrementally, you sort of don't see the whole picture, and that's
Mm.
when the sort of assumptions tend to fall down, I think.
Mm. Actually, on that, what matters more during this scale? Speed, structure, people? What would you say?
Uh, it's kind of all three, isn't it? I mean, I think it's always, if you've got good people,
Mhm.
they'll find a way around other
Yeah.
stuff. Um, I think the structure is always a funny one because, wherever I've been, even in big banks, right, the structure chart changes on like a monthly basis because
Yeah.
you have this like operating model that you think you're working towards, and then something happens and you just shuffle it. So I do think structure tends to be the thing that is it's not an easy win, but it's almost like it's a procrastination that makes you feel
Yeah.
like you're making progress. It's kind of I'm struggling with my hiring, but it's fine. I'll just redo the structure chart, and then it will all look okay again.
Yeah.
That does happen more than you would hope. Um, but yeah, no, I think the key is to have the right people. Right, if you've got
Yeah.
really good people, they'll work their way around everything else. So.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes I feel, we talk so much these days, AI, all the new things coming in, but every conversation I have with a founder, we still come back to people. People are really the ones that kind of, there to deliver. So before we finish, I'm going to ask you one last question. What advice would you give to yourself at the start? So if you could go back all these years, what is the one thing you would say to yourself?
I think it's about these metrics that we actually started to come full circle. I think it's very easy, and especially if you live in this world, this like startup world, like to judge yourself on what are ostensibly vanity metrics. So like
Mm.
headcount, revenue, things like that. And I think
Yeah.
none of that really matters. Even sort of valuation doesn't particularly matter if you get
Mm.
massively diluted. So it's kind of, I think it's focused on what's important to you,
Mm.
whether it be anything from intangibles like just having a good work-life balance. Some people aren't starting a business to create a $10 billion business, right? They're
Yeah.
starting a business to give themselves flexibility
Yeah.
to go and pick up their kids from school. So I think it's what's important to you from the business. And if it is valuation, then again, is that valuation of the overall company, or is it valuation of your ownership in the company?
Yeah.
Because again, that might cause you to do quite different things. So I think
Mm.
it's just being very, very clear on what your objectives are really right at the beginning.
Mm.
Um, I think once people get into a business, and they start working on it, then they'll use, all these methodologies like, KPIs, OKRs, all this sort of stuff. But people don't really do that before they start, which maybe is probably the best thing to do, is to like set out what are your goals personally from what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, what I can say is big thank you for, first of all, your time. And it's been really, really insightful hearing from you. You are there literally not just done one business before, you've got that experience, but you're doing it again. And, hearing these honest conversations, what scaling looks behind the scenes is, very refreshing. So first of all, thank you. Really, really huge congratulations to the new business. I wish you the whole big success ahead of you. Hopefully, not many issues and problems. However, I do feel, with your leadership and your skills and experience, you will be able to overcome any challenges ahead. So huge thank you. And again, well done on Finclusion.
Great. Cheers, Santa. Great to speak to you.